The amber glow of streetlights cast long shadows across Highway 23, their steady rhythm broken only by the occasional flicker of a dying bulb. It was the kind of night officer Mike Martinez had come to know well in his 15 years on the force, quiet, cool, with a thin fog rolling in from the river valley. The type of night where even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The digital display on his cruiser's dashboard read 11:34 p.m. when he first noticed the silver Honda Civic. At first glance, nothing seemed particularly unusual about the vehicle. It was maintaining the speed limit, its taillights were functioning properly, and it appeared well maintained. But something about its movement caught Mike's trained eye. The car would drift slightly toward the center line, correct itself with an almost mechanical precision, then gradually begin drifting again. Probably another tired driver, Mike muttered to himself, reaching for his coffee cup only to find it empty. He'd seen countless drivers fighting fatigue on this stretch of road, their vehicles performing this same dance of drift and correction. But as he followed the Honda for another quarter mile, something felt different. The corrections were too aggressive, too uncertain, like someone learning to steer for the first time. Mike flipped on his cruiser's lights, expecting the usual immediate response, a driver startling to attention, a quick and somewhat panicked pull to the shoulder. Instead, the Honda continued for another 30 seconds, its movements becoming more erratic before finally, almost reluctantly, easing onto the shoulder. "Dispatch, Unit 247," Mike called in, his voice carrying the casual professionalism of routine. "Initiating a traffic stop on Highway 23, mile marker 47. Silver Honda Civic, license plate." He rattled off the numbers automatically while reaching for his flashlight. The beam of light swept across the Honda's rear window as Mike approached, and that's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. His pace slowed, instincts honed by years of experience telling him this was no ordinary stop. The crying grew louder as he neared the driver's window, mixing now with what sounded like someone else's sobs. Mike's flashlight beam finally reached the driver's side window, and the sight before him made his blood run cold. His grip on the flashlight tightened involuntarily, its beam shaking slightly as he processed what he was seeing. There, barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel, sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Tears streamed down the child's face as he gripped the wheel with trembling hands, his knuckles white with tension. In that moment, every assumption Mike had made about this traffic stop evaporated. This wasn't about drunk driving or fatigue, this was something else entirely, something that made his stomach twist with both concern and dread. As the baby's cries grew more insistent from the back seat, Mike realized this night was about to become anything but routine. "It's going to be okay, Sarah. Please stop crying." Tommy Anderson's voice cracked as he whispered to his baby sister, trying to sound braver than he felt. His hands were sweating against the steering wheel, and every shadow on the highway made his heart jump. The weight of his mother's car keys felt like lead in his pocket, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made. 12 hours earlier, it had been just another Thursday. Tommy sat at their small kitchen table, pushing around the last few pieces of his mac and cheese, while 6-month-old Sarah babbled happily in her high chair. Their mom, Sandra, had called during her dinner shift at Mel's Diner to check on them, just like she always did. "Remember to give Sarah her formula at 7, she'd said, her voice warm despite the exhaustion Tommy could hear in it. "And make sure you finish your math homework, sweetie. I'll be home by 10. That was the last normal moment of the day. The second call came at 7:43 p.m. Tommy remembered the time exactly because he'd just finished measuring out Sarah's formula when the phone rang. This time it wasn't his mum's voice, but a stranger's calm, professional, speaking words that didn't make sense at first. Something about his mother collapsing at work. Emergency room. Acute appendicitis. Immediate surgery required. "Is there an adult who can come stay with you?" the nurse had asked. Tommy's mind had raced through their limited options. Dad had never been in the picture. Aunt Marie lived in Colorado. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, was visiting her daughter in Florida. The regular babysitter, Jenny, was away at college. Each possibility crumbled as quickly as he thought of it. Yes, he'd lied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Our neighbor is coming over." But as the evening wore on, Sarah's formula supply dwindled, and her cries grew more insistent. Tommy tried everyone he could think of, his mum's co-workers, parents of school friends, even his math teacher. Some didn't answer. Others couldn't help. With each failed call, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. By 11 p.m., Sarah was wailing inconsolably, her last bottle long empty. Tommy stood in their small living room, surrounded by family photos that seemed to watch him with judging eyes. There was the picture from Sarah's birth, his mom beaming despite her exhaustion. The one from his 11th birthday, where they'd managed to scrape together enough for a small party. His favorite was from last Christmas, Sarah's first, with all three of them squeezed onto their worn couch, his mom's arms wrapped protectively around them both. Sandra Anderson had always been their rock, working double shifts at the diner and picking up weekend catering jobs to keep them afloat. She'd taught Tommy responsibility, drilled into him the importance of looking after his sister, of being the man of the house when she couldn't be there. But she'd never meant for it to come to this. Tommy's eyes fell on his mother's car keys, hanging by the door where she always left them. He knew the basics of driving. He'd watched his mum countless times, had even begged her to let him practice in empty parking lots. She'd always laughed, saying he needed to wait a few more years. But now, Sarah's cries echoed through their small apartment, each sob feeling like a physical pain in Tommy's chest. The hospital was only 15 minutes away by car. He knew the route by heart. They passed it every day on the way to school. His mum needed them, and Sarah needed her formula, which was stored in the diaper bag still sitting in the car's trunk. Think, he whispered to himself, pacing the living room. There has to be another way, but as midnight approached and Sarah's wails grew hoarse, Tommy realized he'd run out of options. With trembling hands, he packed Sarah's diaper bag with fresh diapers and what little supplies they had left. He bundled her into her warmest onesie, triple-checking the straps of her car seat, just like his mum had taught him. The whole time, he kept repeating the same words in his head. Sometimes you have to be brave. Sometimes you have to be brave. Getting the car seat into the Honda was the hardest part. It was awkward and heavy, and Sarah screamed even louder at being moved. But Tommy remembered exactly how his mum positioned it, knew it had to be rear-facing, because Sarah was still so small. He checked and rechecked the base, tugging at the straps until his fingers hurt. The driver's seat felt enormous when he finally slid behind the wheel. He had to scoot it all the way forward just to reach the pedals, and even then, his feet barely touched. The key trembled as he brought it to the ignition, and the engine's sudden roar made him jump. "It's okay, Sarah," he said, more to himself than his sister. "We're going to see Mummy. Everything's going to be fine." But as he carefully backed out of their parking spot, trying to remember everything he'd observed about driving, a cold fear settled in his stomach. He knew what he was doing was wrong, dangerous even. If they got caught, he could get in serious trouble. His mum could get in trouble. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror at Sarah's tear-stained face, he straightened his shoulders. Sometimes being the man of the house meant making impossible choices. Sometimes being brave meant being scared but doing it anyway. Taking a deep breath, Tommy put the car in drive and headed toward the highway, praying that they'd make it to the hospital without anyone noticing. A 12-year-old behind the wheel. Officer Mike Martinez kept his flashlight beam steady on the driver's side window, years of training warring with his instincts as a father. The boy behind the wheel couldn't have been older than his own son, and the terror in his eyes made Mike's chest tighten. The baby's cries from the backseat pierced the night air, adding urgency to an already tense situation. "Step out of the vehicle, son," Mike said, trying to keep his voice firm but gentle. When the boy didn't move, only gripped the steering wheel tighter, Mike added, "I'm not going to hurt you. But we need to talk about what's going on here." "I can't," the boy choked out. "I can't leave Sarah. She needs formula, and Mom's in the hospital, and nobody would help us." And the words tumbled out in a rush, interrupted by hitching sobs. Mike's radio crackled. "Unit 247, do you need backup at your location?" He hesitated, hand hovering over his radio. Protocol dictated immediate backup for any situation involving minors, especially one this unusual. But something in the boy's desperate explanation made him pause. "Negative, dispatch. Situation under control. Stand by for further." Lowering his flashlight slightly, Mike crouched down to eye level with the driver's window. "What's your name, son?" Tommy. Tommy Anderson." The boy wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "That's my sister Sarah in the back. She's 6 months old, and she's hungry, and Mum had to have emergency surgery at Memorial. And I tried calling everyone, officer, I really did. But nobody would answer, and Sarah kept crying, and I didn't know what else to do. And slow down, Mike's mind raced through options. He should call Child Protective Services, should secure the vehicle, should follow procedure, but 15 years of police work had taught him that sometimes humanity had to come before protocol. Tell me about your mum. What happened? As Tommy explained about his mother's collapse at the diner and the appendicitis, Mike noticed details his training had taught him to look for. The car seat was properly installed. The boy had adjusted the mirrors and seat position as best he could. He'd even remembered to turn on the headlights. This wasn't reckless joy riding, this was a desperate attempt by a child trying to hold his family together. Sarah's cries grew more insistent, and Tommy twisted in his seat, reaching awkwardly toward the back. Please, she needs her formula. It's in the diaper bag in the trunk. Mom always keeps extra there, but I couldn't reach it before we left, and… Mike's decision crystallized. Put the car in park and unlock the doors. The boy's face crumpled. Are you going to arrest me? No, son. I'm going to help you. The car doors unlocked with a soft click. Mike opened the driver's side door slowly, noting how Tommy's hands shook as he released the steering wheel. In the back seat, Sarah had worked herself into a full meltdown, her face red with exertion. Stay there for a moment, Mike instructed, moving to the trunk. Inside, he found a well-organized diaper bag with several bottles of premixed formula. His own memories of midnight feedings and desperate drives with crying babies flooded back as he retrieved a bottle. Mike radioed dispatch again. This is Unit 247. I need you to confirm something at Memorial Hospital. Patient named Sandra Anderson, admitted tonight for emergency surgery. And get me Officer Chen if she's available. While waiting for confirmation, he helped Tommy prepare the bottle for Sarah, watching as the boy expertly tested the temperature on his wrist, a gesture so practiced it spoke volumes about his regular responsibilities. She should have her own room assignment by now, Mike said softly. We can find out exactly where your mum is. Dispatch crackled back to life, confirming Sandra Anderson's presence at Memorial and her room number in the surgical recovery ward. Officer Sarah Chen's voice followed Unit 247. This is Chen. What do you need? Mike looked at Tommy, who was now half-turned in his seat, holding the bottle for his sister. The baby's cries had subsided to hungry gulping sounds, and some of the wild panic had left the boy's eyes, replaced by exhaustion and worry. Chen, I need a favor. Can you swing by 1242 Maple Street, apartment 3 billion? It's the Anderson residence. They're going to need some supplies from home. Tommy's head snapped up. How did you know where we live? Your mum's address came up when I ran the plates, Mike explained. Standard procedure. He turned back to his radio. Chen, you'll need to get the spare key from under the blue flower pot. Grab enough supplies for a baby, diapers, clothes, formula, and some clean clothes for a 12-year-old boy. Copy that, Chen responded, and Mike could hear the curiosity in her voice. Need anything else? Mike looked at Tommy again, saw how his shirt was wrinkled and stained with what looked like baby formula and tears. Grab the kid's toothbrush and maybe a jacket. It's getting cold. The next few minutes were filled with quiet activity. Mike helped Tommy secure Sarah's car seat more firmly, noting how the boy hovered anxiously nearby, unwilling to be separated from his sister for even a moment. He checked the formula supply, made sure the diaper bag was within easy reach, and then faced the biggest decision of the night. Protocol said to call CPS to have the children taken into custody until their mother could be reached. It said to impound the vehicle, file charges, create an incident report that would follow this family for years. But as he watched Tommy stroke his sister's cheek while she drank her bottle, Mike saw something else: a child forced to make an impossible choice between breaking the law and failing his family. His radio crackled again. Unit 247, Lieutenant Rogers is requesting a situation update. Mike took a deep breath. This decision could cost him his badge if it went wrong, but sometimes being a good cop meant being a good human first. Tommy, he said, I want you to listen carefully. What you did tonight was incredibly dangerous. You could have been hurt. Your sister could have been hurt. I need you to promise me you'll never do anything like this again. The boy nodded solemnly, tears welling up again. I promise. I didn't know what else to do. I know, son. I know. Mike straightened up, making his final decision. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to slide over to the passenger seat. I'm going to drive you and Sarah to the hospital myself. Officer Chen will meet us there with your things. But first, I need to call this in." He keyed his radio one last time. "Dispatch, Unit 247. I'm escorting 2 minors to Memorial Hospital to join their mother, Sandra Anderson, in the surgical recovery ward. Officer Chen is assisting. Situation is under control." There was a pause before dispatch responded. "Unit 247, Lieutenant Rogers wants to know if you need CPS involvement." Mike watched as Tommy carefully burped his sister, his small hands gentle but confident. Despite his fear and exhaustion, the boy's first priority was still his sister's well-being. Some kind of protective services would eventually need to be involved, but not tonight. Tonight, these kids needed compassion more than they needed procedure. Negative on CPS. At this time Mike responded. "Family situation is stable. We'll submit full report in the morning." As he helped Tommy move to the passenger seat, Mike caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the car window. He looked tired, worried, but certain. In 15 years of police work, he'd learned that the right thing and the by-the-book thing weren't always the same. Tonight he chose to be the kind of officer he'd want to encounter if his own children were ever in crisis. Officer Martinez, Tommy's voice, was small but steadier now. "Thank you. For not separating us. For understanding." Mike started the car, adjusting the heat to ward off the night's chill. "Sometimes, Tommy, life puts us in impossible situations. What matters isn't that we made a mistake, but that we find the courage to ask for help." As they pulled onto the highway, Sarah finally drifting off to sleep in her car seat, Mike knew the night was far from over. There would be questions to answer, reports to file, explanations to make. But looking at the 2 children in his care, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes the best way to serve and protect meant protecting not just people's safety, but their dignity and their families as well. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across Sandra Anderson's face as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Post-surgery complications had developed internal bleeding that the doctors hadn't anticipated. In the hallway outside her room, Dr. Rachel Chen, no relation to Officer Chen, was explaining the situation to the charge nurse when she heard the commotion from the emergency entrance. Officer Mike Martinez burst through the doors, carrying a sleeping Sarah while Tommy ran alongside him, clutching his sister's diaper bag. Behind them, Officer Sarah Chen followed with an overnight bag and what looked like half of the children's bedroom packed into various containers. "We need to find Sandra Anderson's room," Mike announced to the startled reception staff, his badge glinting under the lights. "Her children are here." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her face grave. "I'm Dr. Chen, Mrs. Anderson's surgeon. We've been trying to reach her family. There's been a complication." Tommy's face went pale. Is his mum going to be okay? The doctor knelt down to Tommy's level, her voice gentle but urgent. "Your mum is very strong, but she's lost some blood. We need to do another procedure, and for that, we need a family member's consent since she's not conscious enough to give it herself." "But I'm just a kid," Tommy whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't." Actually, Mike interrupted, shifting Sarah in his arms. "I took the liberty of calling Mrs. Anderson's sister in Colorado while we were on our way. She's on a video call right now." He pulled out his phone, where Aunt Marie's worried face was visible on the screen. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "You thought to." 15 years on the force teaches you to think ahead," Mike said simply. "Marie, can you hear the doctor?" What followed was a flurry of activity. While Aunt Marie provided the necessary consent via video call, Officer Chen organized a makeshift nursery in an empty family waiting room, complete with a portable crib borrowed from the pediatric ward. Hospital staff, moved by the sight of Tommy's obvious exhaustion and worry, brought blankets, coffee for the officers, and juice for Tommy. As Sandra was wheeled back into surgery, Tommy stood watching through the window, his hand pressed against the glass. Mike stood behind him, a steady presence in the chaos. Officer Martinez, Tommy's voice, was barely a whisper. "What if she doesn't?" "She will," Mike interrupted firmly. "Your mum is fighting to get back to you and Sarah. And until she does, you're not alone anymore." As if to prove his point, the waiting room had begun to fill with people. The diner's night shift workers, hearing about Sandra's condition, arrived with food and comfort. Mrs. Peterson, The elderly neighbor who'd returned early from Florida after Officer Chen's call sat rocking Sarah while humming soft lullabies. Jenny, the college-age babysitter, had driven 2 hours after getting the message, bringing her textbooks so she could study while helping watch the children. Even Lieutenant Rogers, who had arrived intending to reprimand Mike for his unorthodox handling of the situation, found himself organizing a schedule with other officers' families to ensure the Anderson children would have support during their mother's recovery. The second surgery lasted 3 hours. Tommy finally fell asleep, curled up in an uncomfortable hospital chair, his face marked with dried tears. Mike stood guard, watching over both children, fielding calls and coordinating with the growing network of community members who wanted to help. When Dr. Chen finally emerged, her surgical mask dangling around her neck, her smile told them everything they needed to know before she even spoke. "She's stable," the doctor announced. "The bleeding is under control. She's going to need time to recover, but she's going to be fine." The relief in the room was palpable. Sarah, as if sensing the change in mood, cooed happily from Mrs. Peterson's arms. Tommy, jerking awake at the doctor's voice, burst into tears, but this time they were tears of joy. "Can we see her?" he asked, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Dr. Chen nodded. "She's still very groggy from the anesthesia, but yes, one at a time, just for a few minutes each." When Tommy entered his mother's room, Mike close behind him, Sandra's eyes fluttered open. Her hand reached weakly for her son's, and despite the tubes and monitors, her voice was clear. "My brave boy," she whispered. "The hospital told me what you did." Tommy's face crumpled. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have driven, but Sarah was crying, and I didn't know what else to do, and—" "Shh," Chandra soothed, her eyes moving to Mike. "The officer told me everything, how you took care of your sister, how you tried to get help." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm not angry, baby. I'm just so grateful you're both safe." Mike stepped forward. "Mrs. Anderson, your son made a dangerous choice, but he did it out of love. And more importantly, when help arrived, he was brave enough to accept it." He placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "That's not just a boy's choice, that's a man's wisdom." Through the window, they could see the waiting room full of people, officers, nurses, neighbors, friends, all drawn together by one boy's desperate act of love and one officer's choice to see beyond the rules to the human need beneath them. Sandra squeezed her son's hand. "We're not alone anymore, are we?" "No," Tommy answered, looking up at Mike with tears in his eyes. "We're not alone at all." 2 weeks after that fateful night, Sandra Anderson sat in her living room, surrounded by what she jokingly called her new extended family. The small apartment was crowded but warm with conversation and laughter. Sarah babbled happily in her playpen, reaching for the stuffed police bear Officer Chen had brought her, while Tommy helped Mrs. Peterson arrange another casserole in their now overflowing freezer. "You really don't have to keep bringing food," Sandra protested weakly, but her smile betrayed her gratitude. Her recovery was progressing well, but the community support hadn't wavered. "Just try and stop us," Jenny, the college student babysitter, called from the kitchen where she was organizing a calendar of volunteer shifts. The magnetic board on the fridge now displayed a color-coded schedule of neighbors, diner staff, and police officers' families who had committed to helping until Sandra was fully recovered. Officer Mike Martinez, now a regular visitor, sat across from Sandra, his coffee cup warming his hands. "The department's new emergency family response protocol goes into effect next week," he announced. "They're calling it the Anderson Initiative." Sandra's eyes widened. "They named it after us." Mike nodded. "Your family's situation opened a lot of eyes. We realized there was a gap in our emergency response system, no clear protocol for helping families in crisis when traditional services aren't immediately available. The new protocol was comprehensive. Every precinct would maintain a network of verified emergency childcare providers available 24/7. Officers would be trained in family crisis intervention, with emphasis on recognizing when flexibility and compassion needed to override standard procedure. The hospital had joined the initiative too, establishing a partnership with local community services to ensure no family would fall through the cracks during medical emergencies. "Lieutenant Rogers says it's already making a difference," Mike continued. "Last week we had a single father rush to the ER after an accident. Instead of his children ending up in temporary state care, we were able to activate the emergency support network immediately. Tommy, who had been listening from the kitchen, joined them in the living room. The past 2 weeks had changed him too. The fear and desperation that had driven him to such extreme measures had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He knew now that being strong didn't mean handling everything alone. "Officer Martinez," Tommy said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up." "Let me guess," Mike smiled. "Police officer." Tommy shook his head. "Social worker. I want to help make sure other kids know they have options when they're scared and don't know what to do." Sandra reached for her son's hand, tears welling in her eyes. The night's events had transformed more than just their immediate circumstances. The diner where she worked had revised its employee emergency policies, setting up a fund and support system for workers in crisis. Her neighbors had created a phone tree, ensuring no one in their building would ever be without help in an emergency. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the community viewed itself. What had started as one boy's desperate decision and one officer's compassionate response had sparked a movement of sorts. Other precincts were already reaching out, looking to implement similar protocols. The local news had run a story about the Anderson Initiative, leading to donations and volunteers from across the city. "We're thinking of expanding the program," Mike explained, "creating a formal network of community resources not just for emergencies, but for everyday support. Single parents, elderly residents, families in transition. The goal is to make sure everyone knows they have somewhere to turn." Mrs. Peterson chimed in from her spot near Sarah's playpen. "It's like my mother used to say, it takes a village." We just needed a reminder of what that really means. Officer Chen, who had arrived with more supplies, added, "The best part is how it's changing police work too. We're not just responding to crises anymore, we're helping prevent them, building trust, making real connections." Sandra looked around her living room at the police officers who had become friends, the neighbors who had become family, the community that had wrapped its arms around her children when they needed it most. "I never thought my appendix would end up changing so many lives," she said with a small laugh. "It wasn't your appendix," Mike corrected gently. "It was your son's love for his family and this community's decision to show up when it mattered. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us of our capacity for compassion." Tommy, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "Mom, I know I scared you that night, driving the car and everything, but I learned something important." "What's that, sweetie?" "Being brave doesn't always mean doing things by yourself. Sometimes it means knowing when to ask for help." The room fell quiet for a moment, absorbing the wisdom in those words. Sarah chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching for her brother, and the tension broke with gentle laughter. As the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting warm light on this gathering of unlikely family, it was clear that what had started as a desperate night had become something much more, a testament to the power of community, compassion, and the changes that can ripple outward from a single act of understanding. The Anderson Initiative would go on to help hundreds of families in crisis, but its true legacy was in the way it changed hearts and minds. It reminded people that behind every emergency, every crisis, every moment of desperation, there were human beings who needed not just help, but understanding. And it proved that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't a policy or a procedure, but the simple decision to see beyond rules to the humanity that connects us all. 1 year to the day after that fateful night. The Memorial Hospital community room was packed with people celebrating the first anniversary of the Anderson Initiative. Sarah, now a toddler taking her first wobbly steps, giggled as she waddled between Officer Mike Martinez's legs, while Tommy, sporting his junior community leader badge, helped distribute celebration cake. Sandra Anderson stood at the podium, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago, my son made a desperate choice that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, thanks to one officer's compassion and an entire community's support, it became the beginning of something beautiful." The statistics spoke for themselves. Over 300 families helped through crisis situations, a network of more than 500 volunteers, 23 police departments across the state adopting similar programs. But the real success stories were in the faces around the room: the single dad who'd found childcare support during his cancer treatments, the elderly couple who now had regular visitors and help with errands, the new immigrant family who'd found a community to welcome them. Officer Martinez, now promoted to Community Relations Coordinator, took his turn at the microphone. What we learned from Tommy and his family wasn't just about emergency response. It was about the power of seeing beyond our initial judgments, about choosing compassion over protocol when lives are at stake. Tommy stood next to his mother, taller now and more confident, but still with that same protective arm around his little sister. The relationship between the Andersons and Officer Martinez had grown into a genuine friendship. Sunday dinners at the Martinez family home had become a tradition, and Mike's own children had gained an honorary brother and sister. The true measure of a community, Tommy said when it was his turn to speak, isn't in how we judge each other's mistakes, but in how we help each other through them. The Anderson Initiative had grown beyond its original scope, spawning mentorship programs, community support networks, and a new approach to emergency response that emphasized humanity alongside procedure. But perhaps its greatest achievement was invisible the countless crises prevented because people now knew they weren't alone. So if you're watching this video today, remember there's no such thing as a perfect solution to life's emergencies. But there is such a thing as perfect compassion, the kind that sees past rules to the heart of human need. Maybe you're someone who needs help right now, or maybe you're in a position to offer it. Either way, you're part of this story. Because in the end, we're all just one emergency away from needing each other. And as Tommy Anderson learned that night, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we can't do it alone. Like this video if it touched your heart. Subscribe to hear more stories about the extraordinary moments that remind us we're all connected. And remember, in your community right now, someone needs exactly what you have to give. The only question is, will you be brave enough to help? After all, every great change begins with a single choice to care.